Hugh was someone who many of us remember from the really important book that he wrote, Turkey that was our years, that wonderful, fascinating and insightful book that enabled an awful lot of us to put things in context that weren't clear at the time. So we have to thank our speaker for writing that book. But since his time in Turkey, and towards the latter of that time, let's get this right, he's been working for the International Crisis Group, and he's now the Director of Communications and Outreach in Brussels. And I imagine that some of the experience there we can talk about tonight if it happens to be relevant. So we'll do the normal thing, we'll leave the floor to our speaker, and then we can have a discussion session afterwards. So please.
Thanks very much, David. Thanks very much for having me here. I think I'll structure my talk is entitled The Turkish Kaleidoscope, because I find it more and more difficult to take an easy line on modern Turkey, which I guess, having lived there for 30 years, is my specialty, and why you've invited me to make some comments. I've actually written 2 books on Turkey. One is the one with the Ozal years is Turkey Unveiled, which I wrote with my ex-wife Nicole Pope, and another one which is called Sons of the Conquerors: The Rise of the Turkic World, which is about my search for the Turkic peoples. And when I got the invitation to come to the Anthropological Society to give a talk, I remember when I launched that book, Sons of the Conquerors, actually in Montreal with my eldest daughter who's in the audience, she'll remember. And after the speech, an old professor came up to me and said, "Thank you for your talk, Mr. Pope. Do you know you could be an anthropologist?" Which, if you, like me, have spent 25 years being a journalist, where you're treated like something the cat brought in most of the time, and everyone assumes that you're venal and trying to cheat on everything. And I don't know quite why everyone thinks that of journalists, but anyway, it was remarkable to me when I joined the International Crisis Group 10 years ago that the diplomats who I used to go and see, and they would give me their time rather disdainfully, would invite me around for lunch to say exactly the same thing, but because I was no longer a journalist, I was somehow trustworthy, which was too bad, because I learned everything I know about Turkey because of the opportunities of journalism, which are to go and see and meet everybody, including the cats, if you want, and there are lots of them in Turkey. And yeah, when I started trying to sort out, and so what I first did was obviously look at what people had done before, and discovered that there are basically 3 types of book on Turkey. There's the academic books on Turkey, which are worthy, and long lists of events and politicians doing this and that, and incredibly complicated lists of cabinets that rise and fall, and are very dry and very difficult to understand because they lack any emotional context. There's another kind of book which was very popular in the 80s and 90s when I was mostly doing my journalism in Turkey, which is the kind of, and they're very popular in England, a book that would mock Turkey, make fun, sort of use Turkey as a kind of exhibit A of how things are different and wrong in the outside world. And I thought that they had a point, mind you. There are some very strange things that happen in Turkey, but it really takes things out of context to see things, to present the Turkey as a sort of a showcase, what's it called in a circus, the place where you go and you get frightened by the fat lady and the dwarf and things. So, you know, every country has these things, and to just focus on them is wrong. And what I also found was that at that time there was a real lack of what you could say were soft books about Turkey. The kind of books you have so many of in Britain about India, say, or France would have about somewhere like Algeria, where the authors feel at peace with their subject and just telling it how it is, or writing novels about it. There are very, very few books about that. Of course, Rose Macaulay and some other authors like that did a very good job, but these books are quite few and far between, especially in the English-speaking world. And then there's another category of books, which are the kind of travelogues, which I think Turkey Unveiled was not travelogues, sort of the contemporary histories. And when I was commissioned by John Murray to write Turkey Unveiled, they were seeking to update a book that had been written in the 50s, or researched in the 50s and published in 72. Apparently they didn't mind that. It was 12 years later. But that's really how slowly things developed in people's minds about Turkey. So I didn't really have much to go on. And the reason I gave the title of the Turkish Kaleidoscope is that, you know, observing Turkish events is like looking through a kaleidoscope, in that there is a certain jumble of things in there, each bit of which stays the same, but every time time turns, they fall into a different constellation. And now this kind of contemporary history of Turkey has become quite common. But even in the 50s, the ones that I've seen in Dutch, in German, in English, they actually, the elements of what people say are what you should know about Turkey, the elements, the building blocks of Turkey, are all roughly the same, interestingly. But I had to, when I was preparing that book, which came out for the first time in 1997, we were sort of feeling our way forward. And Turkey at that time was still very dominated by the Turkish government Republican narrative, which was basically that Turkey had magically appeared in 1923 and was somehow created by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, an extraordinary brave war of liberation, and replacing a defunct and totally useless Ottoman regime that had no merit whatsoever. And everything good came after the invention of the Republic in 1923. And it was a powerful narrative. I mean, there was an element of truth in it. But as I began to become more serious about writing the book, I began to sort of pick up different things. And as I said, there weren't many normal books to draw from, so it was a bit of an ad hoc experience as I trawled through the literature. And I was just thinking when I was coming here, which books would I highlight that really opened my eyes. And one of them was a book by an Italian travel writer that came out in 1860. Mr. De Amicis wrote this book about Istanbul, about what it's like to be in Istanbul. And what opened my eyes about there was his description of the streets of Istanbul, this colourful, crazy muddle that somehow worked. And how the big picture might be very hard to understand, but when you were locally trying to deal with something, it all came together, which was certainly my experience of Istanbul. So suddenly, the 1923 watershed didn't seem to mean very much anymore. The next eye-opening thing for me was because to earn my living, to start with, I learned Arabic and went to work in the Middle East. I could somehow sort of read Ottoman texts in the most basic form, and I normally would not be able to read very much because, you know, frankly, Arabic is quite different from Ottoman. But a friend of mine bequeathed me a set of the Resimli Gazette, a late Ottoman picture post kind of magazine. And so one day I opened it up just to see what it was. And it was actually an account of the 1908 counter-revolution, when the Taksim barracks were stormed by the Hareket orders. Anyway, it was the Resimli Gazette who was telling the story of these events. And I suddenly realized I was able to read it. And because the tone, the actual language, this Ottoman language, was like reading Hurriyet, except it was 80 years old. And I had been told that there was nothing in common, it was a completely different language that the Ottomans spoke. But no, the journalistic lingo had a lot of things in common. You know, obviously with Ottoman twists and pirouettes and stuff, with Arabic and Persian phrases. But it's so that was something. Then again, so there's a lot more continuity than I thought. And another fine book that unexpectedly I spent a lot of time reading. I read it cover to cover, 5 volumes of Kenan Evren's personal memoir. I don't even know whether he wrote it himself, but I think he had something to do, because it's a very authentic voice. And he talks about himself and his views of everything. And it was clear that because everyone has this worry about Evren. What was he doing? He was head of the army, did this massive coup, which was so traumatic for Turkey at the time. Yet he introduced Islamic teaching into schools, which has developed into partially into what we have today. And it turned out that that Evren's, I think his father and grandfather, I forget which, were parts of the Ottoman tax administration, which was run by the French. But he also had an imam in the family. So he knew that he wanted what he thought of as an authentic Islam to be established. At the same time, his wife was totally superstitious. She kept little shoebox of things under her bed, which Kenan Evren reproduces in memoir. This is the general in charge of the whole Turkish armed forces at the height of their power. And his wife has got a shoebox under their bed with all kinds of strange numerological numbers, which she is trying to predict the future on, which he has to deal with when he comes home at night. And he obviously cares about his wife, so he takes it all rather seriously, to the extent of reproducing it in his book. I think, well, this is not the Turkish army that I thought it was. It must be a much more sort of nuanced and complex thing than you'd expect. And by the way, he's not alone. There's currently a political leader in Turkey, Devlet Bahçeli, who will also stand up on a podium and give long lectures about how you can really analyze the recent event because of the way that the date reads out in numbers. Yeah. And so I realized that was another thing. So the question of what counts as education, what people assume are valid points of departure for making an analysis, are not necessarily the same ones as the UCL might use. You know, it's so I don't know. So these things came up in opening my eyes about what it was. But anyway, as I said, you know, the elements of this kaleidoscope came clear to me, and since then I've seen that most other books eventually come to the same conclusion. And let me just go through them for you as I saw them. First of all, this question of where do the Turks come from? Okay. I had never even thought that I would bother with that in the book, but as the research went on, it became clear that we couldn't leave that bit out. It would be like writing a history of Britain without mentioning the Norman invasion. Because that, actually, if you want to talk about it later, there are lots of comparisons that I now see between Britain and Turkey, but we're just talking about Turkey now. But one of the things is that they had an invasion in around 1066, which defined the future of Anatolia, in that it brought a Turkish ethnic ruling element into the country, which has stayed there ever since. And the language has come to dominate the whole country through centuries of developments. And you couldn't miss out this thing. One of my favorite things in writing the second book was when I got to spend some time with the leader of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev. And like many people, it's very strange how many people do self-identify as Turks, while saying that they are the real Turks and the other ones are not. And as I was saying to David earlier on, one of those people who self-identifies as a Turk is Babur, the founder of the Mughal dynasty in India. It was astonishing if you didn't happen to know that already. That the Turkishness would have such an extension. And Nursultan Nazarbayev, when I asked him, so what are you? And he said, I'm a Turk. He was in his plane, his presidential plane from Kazakhstan. He's the leader of the Kazakhs. And he said, I'm a Turk. And I was taken aback. He saw that. He said, no, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking about those people in Anatolia, aren't you? No. He said, we sent some armies over there 500 years ago, and they conquered it, and they married the local girls, and they've become what they are, but we're the real Turks. He has his own country, the size of Western Europe. But so anyway, so that's one element of the roots. Another element that you can't not be conscious of when you're thinking or writing about Turkey or assembling a book is, if those people came from Anatolia, what about the populations who were there before, who most times in the Ottoman Empire had very big minorities: Jews, Armenians, Greeks, Kurds. All kinds of. If you read Amiches, there's no end to them, because you have all the Balkan peoples as well who are coming in. But by 1940 or so, actually by 1960, you have a country that's presenting itself as ethnically one thing, and that doesn't stand up to inspection, of course. And in the 80s, it was still rather difficult to talk about that. It was very difficult to talk to my Turkish friends about Armenians or Greeks or Kurds. And yet, I discovered in Istanbul, the Chamber of Commerce, for instance, was 50% non-Turkish up until 1955, which means that the continuation from the Ottoman times into the early Republican period was very strong. And so when thinking about what on earth happened to these populations, at that time, the formulation Armenian Genocide was completely unthinkable. And now, I've been at dinner parties in Istanbul with former heads of the foreign ministry and foreign minister even, no, not foreign minister, heads of foreign ministry, very leading ambassador, just saying, yes, of course it's a genocide, but we've got to do this or that. So the consciousness of this has really changed. But back in, the issue is still there. I would say that in Turkey, people are much more, the educated part of the population is much more conscious of the Armenian story than anybody was 10, 20, 30 years ago. And 30 years ago, nobody knew anything about it. Now people do know. And I think the Greek question is a little less, because less people died and there was a war going on. It's less traumatic to talk about. But I think the loss of the Greek population is also a huge blow, like the loss of the Armenian population. And that blow to the educated culture of Anatolian cities is only now being appreciated. And you're seeing these grieving books coming out, which is new. But all that it's an aspect of Turkey, a layer of Turkish or Anatolian history that if you don't think about it, you don't understand why people are as they are today. The Ottoman Empire itself was another issue that was something that I had to get straight in my own mind, and it's something that in Turkey is viewed one way, and in Britain, for instance, I think there's a sort of an idea of the Ottoman Empire which is quite grandiose, actually. It certainly wasn't when I arrived in Turkey. People would despise it. There was no talk even of the Ottomans. They were nobodies, or they had to be nobodies. Now in Turkey, of course, there's a kind of neo-Ottomanism, which has gone too far the other way. But for me, the little book that I saw that opened my eyes on that was visiting İsmet İnönü's house in Ankara once. I found I think it was 1921 magazine, sort of the Paris Match of Istanbul at the time. It had the front page photo, in black and white of course, was of an Edwardian gentleman with his daughter in a pretty white frock. I thought, oh gosh, that's interesting. Who would look like that in the Ottoman Empire? And it turned out to be the Sultan. There was looking as though he could be going to a British weekend shooting party. And it was an astonishing idea, because of course Ataturk and his followers have all made it look as though Ataturk was the first one to adopt what were considered Western ways now, but were then, I think, seen as being the civilized, powerful world. So, when assembling the Ottoman bits of one's Turkish Kaleidoscope, you have to really spend a lot of time wondering which bits of the Ottoman Empire were good and which were less good. And I think one of the less good heritages of the Ottoman Empire is the early Ottoman Empire was built basically on, how can one say it politely? Booty. Send the army out, raid the Christian castles, pillage the landscape, distribute the proceeds among the troops, and go back home for the winter. And it's not a sustainable model. No. And I think that that idea of how one might as a model of governance is sometimes I feel it in the way that the Turkish politicians view international lending institutions. I remember newspaper headlines that when some finance minister would come back from Washington with a good load of booty, and there would be sort of really celebratory articles in the press. And so, again, there was, for me, a sense of continuity on both sides. No book about Turkey is complete without its Ataturk section. He is an extraordinary character, and I'm sure those of you who are fully paid up members of the Anglo-Turkish section of society will have read the life of Ataturk, done by Yes, Andrew Mango.
Yes, they've all read it.
It's a fantastic book, and it says everything you need to know. But because he says it in a totally factual way, I've even seen a copy of it in a place of honour in the headquarters of the General Staff of the Turkish Armed Forces. So it says everything that we always wondered about Ataturk. It's all in there, but it's a very
Mango's book.
Mango's book, yes.
Well,
Yes.
He was a sort of 11 time or something.
He was amazing.
Amazing man.
Amazing man. Brought up speaking Russian. Yeah.
That's
ages.
right, yeah.
Anyway, so you have your Ataturk thing, and obviously Ataturk did this, led this extraordinary movement that gave Turkey a war of liberation and a liberation story, and he was. What people don't say so much is that if you go to the Taksim statue and look carefully, who are the people around him in that statue? Includes Soviet officers, because Turkey's always had this kind of ambivalence to Russia, because he was presenting himself as this anti-imperialist at times, and getting gold from the Soviets as a result. But if you go 5 years later, he's copying laws from European states verbatim into the Turkish law book. So, people worrying about where does the Turkish-European Union convergence story come from? You can go back to Ataturk copying European laws, or you can go back to the 1870s, where Turkey is part of the concert of Europe. I don't know how sincere the Europeans were. I doubt they were very sincere. They never seemed to be very sincere in their dealings with Turkey. But at least Turkey had a sort of an honorary seat at the table for a while then. So, the Ataturk had both sides to him, and I think he lost interest after a few years. But he was still the big man and running the show, and he lasted on for a good 15 years, which is, I think, the last 5 years of it were pretty. He was a symbolic rather than a real active leader. And then you move, he sort of fades into the Republican secular, the CHP ruled years of Turkey, which are rather bureaucratic, and theoretically left-wing, but probably we'd see it as an authoritarian way of running the country. Then you have this remarkable phenomenon of Adnan Menderes arriving on the scene and becoming an incredibly popular leader. And flagrantly corrupt as well. Yet he captured the mind of the Turkish masses. He built many roads. He destroyed many bits of Istanbul to make other roads, and he started a process which gave birth to two other big leaders: Özal, who had virtually the same policies, and Erdogan, who has a similar policy. He has represented a constituency which I think is very important to understand. Again, is another of those things that come and go in any portrayal of Turkey. Is the fact that if you think that the Anatolian cities of the Ottoman Empire were denuded of their natural middle classes, who were at that point the minorities, the Christians and the Greeks, they had to be replaced. Plumbing, carpentry, lawyers, all these things. All these things had to be done, and the Turkish bourgeoisie took the place of the people who'd gone, and in some cases probably acquired the tools of their trade, their premises at fire sale prices. especially in the 1920s. I still remember in Istanbul that the carpenters who would help me with the work I needed done in my house would very often have been taught by Greek carpenters, and they would have literally inherited their the carpentry bench. And they would remember them with great goodwill, but the fact was the Greeks weren't there anymore. And this class that came up were very often people who'd lost their own homes in the Balkans because they'd been kicked out from there during the wars beforehand. So they didn't feel too guilty about taking over these properties, these professions, these livelihoods, these houses, because they'd lost their own, and they wanted to start anew. But they also became very loyal to the Republican ethic. And that's a backbone of the CHP, the Republican People's Party. And that's why it's in Western Turkey as well, mainly, because it's based on peoples who, like Ataturk, came from the Balkans. Whereas the people who support Menderes, Özal and Erdogan are above all the people of Anatolia, and they're more relaxed, conservative. I say relaxed in a sense of not being hung up. They are who they are, but I would say they were quite, especially as you go east, they're not relaxed. They're quite harsh patriarchal societies, but still. And they are the natural majority of the country, not surprisingly. And so when Menderes, Özal and Erdogan found a way to plug into that natural majority, they came to power for long periods. But unfortunately, because the Turkish institutions have never been allowed to develop with any strength, the big man has always grown bigger and bigger and bigger, and then bang, something happens, and they fall back to the beginning again. Turkey somehow is resilient enough to come back. So those two communities are very important to remember, and you see them playing off against each other throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And that, even today, I would say there's an element of it. And you could see that there's, I guess there's British people in the audience. I mean, it's not a class system in Turkey, but there was definitely a snobbery by the Republican class towards the rural, conservative Anatolian class that meant that the two sides could barely stand each other. And at the beginning of the AKP years, it was the most extraordinary thing in Turkish cities, where the urban elite would generally be secularist, would be genuinely horrified that such what they would see as peasants were taking over their country. And it's but as a reporter, as someone who was hanging around, I actually found the new blood from Anatolia very refreshing at the time, because now the reason I use the word relaxed is there was a sense of these people being at peace with themselves, and they weren't hung up about being European or not European, Islamic or not Islamic. You could have normal conversations with them about things. It wasn't all about, you hate us or you did this, or which you could have with the Kemalists. Unfortunately, it seems that the AKP has moved into the status quo camp now, so that it's a bit more difficult to talk with them now, but I'm talking about the early years of the AKP. So anyway, you're going through the elements, you have this switching of the Republican and the Conservatives through that period of history. And we also have other things which you have to remember about Turkey, like Cyprus. I won't say more than that than the word, because it's a whole universe to itself, but Cyprus is, it's there, it's a symbol and cause and effect and everything. It's a bit of everything. Fascinating place, fascinating problem. We could talk all evening about it, but you can't have a picture of Turkey without that being in there. And then of course the army too. The army, this extraordinary institution that every Turkish state, and Turkey counts, 16 on the presidential seal, and there's probably now, if you include all the Turkic ones you have now, you're getting into the 20s. But anyway, the first 16, in according to traditional Turkish view, is that each of them was founded by, each state was founded basically by an army, and it felt like that in the 80s in Turkey, where someone like Kenan Evren, who I once met, they felt like they owned the country, those generals. And in a way, I suppose they kind of had created the country, because they're the ones who ran the War of Independence, which created Turkey. Of course, their legitimacy came from various popular congresses, but the fact is they did the fighting, and they retained the effective power, and the generals have always been very close to the top. And it's actually rather an aberration right now that the army has dropped out of sight, and possibly forever, I'm not sure, but I think that's one big change in Turkey since over the 30 years. The coup that happened, the coup attempt that happened on July the 15th, the idea that, I mean, as an analyst, I'd always said it's impossible. You can't have a coup when you have a conscript army and 50% of the population is voting for the government. It's never going to work. And the idea that anyone would even try that within the army seems absolutely mad, and it was clearly ill-planned and everything. So I don't know how much it represents the whole army, is what I'm trying to say, and none of us really know what has happened to that institution. But if you're looking at Turkey over the last 100 years, the army is so important that I can't believe that it will be completely eclipsed as an element, but I don't think it can have a political role until things fall apart again, which I'll come to in a minute. Islam is another topic that everyone loves to talk about Turkey, which is strange, because in my working life in Turkey, I would never think, oh gosh, I'm having a Muslim conversation now. Even if you were in a mosque, you wouldn't think of it as being about something unusual. For instance, the Turkish newspapers at Ramadan, if you read the good advice in the Ramadan pages, it's like listening to an English country vicar telling people to be good. It's an enormous range of applications of a religion that can obviously be perverted into Islamic State if you want. But on the whole, Turkey has a lot of competing strands of Islam. It's a religious country. I mean, I'm not trying to downplay the presence of Islam, but just saying, to try and judge anything by it in particular is very, very hard, and especially to try and join Turkey with other countries in blocks just because they happen to be Muslim is you will end with madness. And by the way, that's one of the biggest mistakes of the Ak parties. They had self-orientalized themselves they'd invented something new, and when they went to Qatar to say, "Hi, we're the new Muslim government of Turkey. You can support us." The Qataris would just say, "Well, get in line. I'm Pakistan. Why everyone else? And Bangladesh. Everyone else has got an Islamic republic. What's so new about that?" And I think they were very disappointed, and they really didn't understand what was at stake, and the misreading of what happened in the Middle East after the Americans began withdrawing after 2005 or 6 when Iraq wasn't working, the existing order just imploded. It wasn't about the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood; it was about the collapse of the existing order, I think, and the ructions that we are seeing continuing and still spreading. The Islamic element. I'm not, Erdogan is probably an Islamist in Islam, but can he impose that on a country that is not got the resources in normal times to force everyone to do the same thing? I mean, it's a tax-raising country. It's not an oil-producing country where the state can just invent a religion and make everyone do it in order to get their daily bread. There has to be more than that. And I don't buy that Erdogan is an authoritarian because he's an Islamist. If you look at the way anything is run in Turkey, you look at the secular companies that dominate Istanbul, they're all run by patriarchies. Sometimes with a woman in charge, but it's still a patriarchy, if you know what I mean. I mean, it's still the same family. And they minority shareholders beware in Turkey, because there's normally only one person running anything, and so I mean, singling Erdogan out is uniquely unusual for that, or uniquely bad because he runs everything himself. It's going a little far. Unfortunately, I would just say that the other theme of looking a bit into the future is that the monopolization of power. This is not the first time it's happened. Obviously, Ataturk did it, Menderes did it, Özal tried to do it, and with varying levels of success. Somehow, when Ataturk died, İsmet İnönü was capable enough to keep the show on the road for another 13 years. But sorry, not 13. Yes, yeah, just 13 years. 14 years. But I think that, unfortunately, what's going to happen when Erdogan is not immortal, at some point he will move on. The longer this concentration of power goes on, the longer the mess will last afterwards. Because we saw that when Özal died. I really remember how, because the way Turkish politics works is a patronage system, but it's not on the party. It's to a person. So, and the next person who's going to come up is going to be someone who's established his or her own patronage network. And to give Erdogan his credit, he has used that network to get himself elected. And he's won those elections by being fantastically charismatic to his own constituency. It may not be your taste, but they're genuinely voting for him because he's captured that, and he's made the system work for him. It's majoritarian. It's very common around the world, but unfortunately, the hangover will be substantial. And to end up on the various bits, I would like to just go to the foreign policy elements. Any kaleidoscope of Turkey, any book about Turkey, has got to have the 4 pillars of Turkish foreign policy, which are really quite simple. You deal with the Russian-dominated area, you deal with the Middle East, you deal with Europe, and you deal with the US. And that's there are little frills on the side, like the time when Turkey was really ambitiously having a Papua New Guinea policy, and in the days that they were able to get themselves elected in the UN Security Council, it must have been great fun to be a Turkish diplomat at that time, discovering new horizons and opening up all over Africa. It was a wonderful time, actually. There was one year there were about 10 new African embassies open in Ankara. That was good fun. But ultimately, Turkey's main 4 relationships remain those 4 I mentioned. The Russian one is amazing. As I said, there were Soviet officers next to Ataturk in the main memorial that is the symbol of the Republic, and yet Turkey's fought 25 wars with Russia and is scared of Russia, and yet Turkey is dependent on for its energy, for its gas supplies, on Russia. And at the same time, it's a member of NATO and the applicant to join the European Union. And yet, 2 days ago, another gas pipeline was signed. It's very strange. And I think Turkey has to be very careful in how it does it. And I'm never quite sure how sincere Turkey is, because it knows that if it goes alone into the Russian den, it will get eaten up. But as long as it's protected by its Western partners, it can negotiate a bit on that. So it's a very interesting and ambivalent process. And clearly, Putin is trying to bring Erdogan onto his side, or at least weaken the ties between Erdogan and the West. Whereas I suspect Erdogan is simply trying to say, "Oh, West, look, I'm going to be really good friends over here unless you come over and help me soon." It's a very interesting thing, and there's also another thing about President Erdogan is that obviously he wants popularity, and there is still a buck to be made in anti-imperialistic rhetoric. And so the Sabah of Tuesday morning has endorsement of Turkey from Venezuela. from Maduros, who's literally run the country off the cliff in Venezuela, and it's absolutely irrational. You know, and Turkey knows that Putin is dangerous in the long run. You can't get too close to Putin. And Azerbaijan, you know, Turkey should be in the position to be a bit bigger than that. I mean, Turkey's much bigger than Azerbaijan, and yet so often Azerbaijan seems to be holding the whip hand. Anyway, I think that many people in Turkey see this, but right now you can't say it, and it's that policy area is it's lucrative for Turkey. The contractors in Russia, if you have a good relationship with Russia, many of your business supporters will be making money, so it's good. But the dangers like that. The Middle East, as I said, I think that Erdogan completely misread the situation in the Arab world and what it meant to be a Muslim, and he also completely misunderstood what the West was ready to do in Syria and what the limits of his power in Syria were. And the result is that they have rushed into a situation where the Middle East is now spilling into the Middle East. There are cities like Diyarbakir, Jizre and Saibin where acres of the urban fabric has been laid flat. I mean, it was just incredibly destructive conflict. Now, the PKK is to blame for that. They're a very ambitious group, and they tried to do too much, and the PKK against the proper Turkish army, there's no contest. And it was madness to think they could get anywhere, and the unfortunate result is real damage to the southeast, and the atmosphere there is dreadful, because the AKP, ironically, is the party that has done the most for the Kurds. And now it's all gone back, and at the same time, IS has come in, and IS has become the natural counterweight to the PKK, because any population can't be just one thing. So you've got the PKK. So if you're not with the PKK, who's going to protect you? Only the biggest, baddest boys on the block will go with the IS. So IS has got a backdoor into the Turkish political space. And IS is an incredibly clever organization in one way, in that it seems to know what tactic to really drive a wedge into Turkey's ethnic and sectarian and social and family. Attacking Kurdish nationalists, because that deepens the rift between mainstream Turks and mainstream Kurds. Hitting the Istanbul airport, devastating for Turkish tourism, devastating for Turkish self-confidence. Even though I live in Brussels, and I was amazed at how Brussels airport was 3 months was still trying to put it back together again from one bomb. In Turkey, they've got it up and running in 12 hours. Just incredible. I love that about Turkey. I sometimes think that in Turkey, if it's not a crisis, everyone falls apart. I mean, normality is just an unbearable thought. Give me a good crisis, then I can operate it.